I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. I said you do know, you've heard of her, and that's Dr. Joannie DeBrito. You've seen her here on Grand Monday nights. She has, we have to ask Dr. Joannie, and sometimes she's come in and give us some 5-minute answers to questions and tell you a little bit about yourself. I'm going to mention, you know this, but for some of our people, that you are a licensed mental health professional with nearly 35 years of experience. Wow, we're lucky to have her here. And she's provided individual, couple, family therapy. So she combines this special expertise to provide resources for families, for grandparents who have been struggling with things in life. So she's answering a lot of questions that we as grandparents have. She's currently serving as a professional resource for the Legacy Coalition. We have asked Dr. Joannie, and you may have noticed today, she wrote a blog that was sent out. It was on a great subject. So she's married. She's got 2 grandkids so far, she says. She and her husband live in Colorado Springs, and she's just a wonderful, wonderful, bright, valuable resource for us. And tonight, talking about this subject that we've had many grandparents ask about, Dr. Joannie, how do you discipline your grandkids? So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Barb, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about that. And I know that many of you are in the situation that I am in when I have my grandkids with me. Sometimes I have to discipline them. And so I'm going to give an example of just a couple of weeks ago, we were having our little story time where my grandchildren read stories. They love to read, and we listen and we respond and ask questions. And just as my granddaughter started reading, my grandson just started acting up, and he started distracting and kind of hanging upside down on the chair and making noise and humming. I bet some of you can relate to this. And we just ignored for a while, thinking he would stop, but no, then he upped the ante and he started being a little bit more distracting. So we had to stop, and I was just about ready to impose some discipline when the doorbell rang, and it was my daughter. And my daughter came to the door, and she started telling us about the fact that the kids had gotten their report cards, and they had both done very, very well, and they had gotten really good behavior reports, except for 2 things, or one thing that applied to both of them. Very surprisingly, their teachers had both said they were having trouble getting distracted in class and also sometimes distracting their peers. So I said, well, that's interesting, because that's kind of what we just saw. And then I had a conversation with my daughter, and we came up together with a discipline of what should happen. And the idea was that my grandson would need to take some time out for the time that he took away from his sister, and that when he came back, he would need to attend to whatever she wanted him to attend to. And we kind of had fun with that. So she came up with something that she knew would be something that he didn't want to do. And then we put the timer on so that he would have to pay attention for the amount of time that he had taken away from her. And I'm going to explain kind of how that fits into a model. So one of the most important things about that story is collaborating with parents. Remember that the parents are the primary caregivers. And assuming you have parents, your children involved with your grandchildren, you need to let them take the lead as the primary caregivers. You need to respect them for having ideas. The problem is that if you launch in with your own ideas and say, hey, I've been a parent longer, I know what to do, very unintentionally, you're kind of communicating disrespect for them. And they are the primary caregivers. So we need to give them the opportunity to really hear, to talk, and for us to be able to hear about the kinds of things that are important to them in terms of discipline. We need to listen to what they expect. We need to also learn about the likely causes of behavior, because they could be biological or they could be environmental. And so depending on whether a discipline, a behavior problem is biological or environmental, we're going to have a different response. We also want to abide by their requests. And one thing that's really helpful is to be with parents when they are talking through a discipline plan for their children and rewards and consequences with their children. Now, that's assuming the children are old enough to understand and hear and be able to also give some of their opinions. But we want them to be there to hear this so they know that parents and grandparents are on the same page and are going to impose the same kinds of consequences and use the same kinds of rewards and so forth, so that there is consistency. Now, this is really important because my granddaughter a few weeks ago did something, just a little something that I needed to impose a consequence for. And she looked at me and said, "Now, do we have to do that, Nana?" And I said, "Sure. Don't you remember we talked to your mom and dad?" And very slyly, she said, "But mommy and daddy aren't here right now." And, very calmly, I just looked at her and said, "You're right, they're not. But I need you to know that I really respect your mom and dad. And because they asked me to follow through, I'm going to do that." And so that reinforced the respect for their children, for their parents, that they need to have. The other thing is that I will regularly tell my grandchildren when I impose some discipline that I am doing that because I want to show that respect and so forth. So I try to be super clear about that. Now, remember, I talked about the importance of figuring out the potential cause, and it is really important to think about whether or not there might be a biological cause for problem behavior, because clearly, if there is, you might be thinking there's something that your son, your grandson or granddaughter is doing that is intentional, and it may not be. It may be something they can't control, and therefore they might not have a choice to be able to change it. So we have to tease out if there's anything biological. So first of all, if there was any drug or alcohol exposure prenatally or after birth, which does happen, if they were adopted with no knowledge of the health history, that there might be something there. If there's some sort of a known disability, that might be something to consider. If a child was adopted from foster care, that's usually because there was some sort of trauma, neglect, or abuse. And then also if there's known exposure to trauma, and then possible current issues. Maybe it's a child with COVID. Maybe it's a child who has an ear infection. Maybe it's something like that. And of course, we all tend to be a little bit more grumpy and maybe misbehave in adult ways when we don't feel well. So we need to make sure that if a child is misbehaving, there isn't a specific biological reason. If there is, they really need to be treated by a medical professional, and probably their behavior will return to normal. So that's an important thing. Now, if you have a grandchild who fits one of those categories of foster care, adoption, or was known to have experienced trauma, you need to understand that typical discipline strategies for typically developing children will not work for those children who have been traumatized. They need a special kind of discipline, which is very well put together in a package called trust-based relational intervention, or TBRI for short. So if you are a grandparent to a grandchild who has a disability or some sort of known physical issue that might contribute to poor behavior, please look into that before trying to use discipline strategies that you would use with typically developing children. Maybe you have 4 grandchildren. If 3 of them are typically developing, but one of them has trauma in their background or a reason that they can't behave in certain ways, in those cases, it's going to be very important for you and their parents to discipline their grandchildren, your grandchildren, in a different way. Okay, so now let's talk about environmental, because the truth is most of the discipline problems are things that kids have learned. Yes, they sometimes learn things from us and from their parents, and we are unintentionally maybe teaching them some bad habits. So under the age of 5, almost always, if a behavior problem is not an issue that's caused by a biological issue, it's usually a result of parenting or organized childcare. And this doesn't mean that we run around blaming parents or blaming ourselves. It just means that we have to acknowledge that all of us at times are going to do things that encourage poor behavior. And so we can just correct those behaviors. So under 5 or to the age of 5, it's usually a result of parenting or childcare issues. Age 6 to 10, it's usually a result of parenting, childcare issues, and then starting to observe peers. I have a granddaughter who just turned 8 today. Today's her birthday. And often she will mention things that are different about her parents versus other parents. So at that age, they're starting to not only pay attention to parenting and childcare, but also their peers and their peers' families and other adults. Then age 11 to 14, it's usually a result of all of what we've already talked about, but also they're often getting into social media, those kinds of things. And so they are getting messages about how they should behave from a broader culture. Age about 15 to 18, typically those kids are starting to really pour into their peers and not so much their parents and grandparents. And so those kids are really making a lot of interpretations about the world, and their behavior is based on the way that they're told to behave. And we know that in the culture today, there are some messages that are not consistent with our biblical knowledge and the mandates that we get from the Bible. And may cause kids to misbehave in ways that are certainly not consistent with our Christian faith. And then over the age of 18, yes, kids 18 and older do need discipline at times. It's different because we hope that by that time, we've taught them a lot of self-discipline. So they start disciplining themselves, and they need to fail and make mistakes and figure things out, but they still can need some guidance. And at that time, the issues that get them into trouble are usually motivated by them trying to meet their goals and trying to get what they want. So with those things in mind, now I want to talk about the best ways for us to respond. And we always want to start with empathy and compassion for our children as their parents and for our grandchildren. And the best parenting style and grandparenting style is known to be authoritative parenting, which is not authoritarian, which is considered to not be a good practice, but authoritative. Authoritative parenting includes clearly stated limits and boundaries that are set for behavior, rewards for good behavior, allowance for natural consequences, and I'll talk about what those are in a minute, logical consequences for poor behavior, and then allowance for kids to weigh in and give their opinion. Now, obviously, discipline at the youngest ages is just going to be between parents and grandparents, because children at 2 years of age can't speak for themselves, or maybe they can, but their ideas are probably not going to be the ideas that we would embrace for good discipline. And so let's talk a little bit about some of those components. So obviously, clearly stated limits. You need to talk together, and parents need to take the lead on limits around things like eating, bedtime, routines, how routines might be different in the week during the weekend, those kinds of things, bedtime routines, bath routines, grooming routines, those kinds of things, and the behavior that's expected for them to show respect for you and your home and your possessions. Then we talk about rewards. So rewards should usually be verbal affirmations. So we want to shy away from giving gifts or giving food as rewards. And the reason for that is because kids are very clever. They figure us out, don't they? I bet some of you are chuckling. You know what happens if you start giving your kids a lot of gifts for doing things well, then pretty soon they start pouring on the charm just to get gifts. And we don't want them to think that behaving well is something that should always be followed by gift giving. So what we want to do in most cases is give verbal affirmations and be really careful to pay attention to when they are behaving well so that you are affirming them. It's very common for parents and grandparents to let their kids play quietly and grandkids play quietly and not interrupt. And then when they start misbehaving, they give them attention. But attention is in itself a reinforcement. So if a child only gets attention when he's misbehaving, he's learning, I need to misbehave in order to get attention. So we really, really want to take that time to make sure that we reinforce that the child is behaving well and that we are pleased with the way he or she is behaving. I like the way you guys are playing together. Thank you so much for being kind to each other. Those kinds of things. You might make handmade things, little coupons, or put little stars on a chart for an award or whatever. And you never take away a reward that's been given as a punishment. Just think about it in terms of the work that you do. You get a paycheck and then maybe you make a mistake at work. Your boss doesn't come and take your paycheck away because you made a mistake. And so they need to keep their rewards that they make. Then with consequences, first of all, if it's appropriate, allow a natural consequence to occur, and that's without any interference. So a granddaughter is out in the yard. Let's say you have an automatic sprinkler system. It's just about to go on and she's going to get wet. And you say, you need to come in. You know, she heard you, but she's ignoring you. Sprinkler system comes on, just let her get wet because she's going to be uncomfortable. She's going to be cold. She might be crying when she comes in. And very calmly, you can say, I know you heard me and you didn't come in, and this is why you got wet. So you let the natural consequences teach the child that next time when Nana says it's time to come in because the sprinklers are going to go on, maybe she'll think next time, and then she'll have that self-discipline to really pay attention. Now, if it's not safe to allow a natural consequence to occur, then you're going to work on a logical consequence, and logical consequences need to be related, respectful, and reasonable. And that's from Jane Nelson's book called Positive Discipline, which is a great one if you want to read a good book. Joss Mahelbo's book is great as well. So I would really encourage you to read that one as well. But they need to be related, respectful, and reasonable. And related means that you relate the consequence to whatever happened. So I know the very first family therapy couple I ever had came in, and as we were talking, I said, well, what made you think you wanted to come in for family therapy? And the kids piped up and said, we've been grounded for 2 years. And I said, 2 years? And they said, yeah, what mom and dad do is every time we do something wrong, they just add a day. So they literally had been grounded for 2 years. Well, grounding is only appropriate if a child has run away. They ran away, so related to that is making them stay home, or they missed curfew, so you make them stay home for the amount of time that they missed or that they were late to curfew. But you want things to be related. So if a child has stolen something, that child needs to pay back or take care of something that he or she has damaged. Grounding is not going to help the child understand what he or she did that's requiring the consequence. So it has to be related, it has to be respectful, and it has to be reasonable. The example I gave before where the children had been grounded for 2 years, not reasonable. That's not reasonable. We want to use those opportunities to help them understand what it is they did by giving them that related consequence, making it respectful in the way we communicate it, not harshly, but you made a mistake, and so this is what needs to happen, and then reasonable, that it really, that kind of like the punishment fits the crime idea. So those are some of the grounding ideas in terms of what needs to happen when you are trying to discipline your grandchildren. And now what I want to transition into is some scenarios. Now, all of this information I'm giving you is on a PowerPoint that's going to come to you when you get the recording for this presentation tomorrow. So I'm just going to let you know that I have scenarios for kids at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18. I know there are other ages. And of course, I am not going to have time to go through all of those tonight, but you will get information about ideas for typical kinds of discipline problems that come up at those ages and how to handle them. But I'm going to start with just the first one being that this, I'm going to start with a 2-year-old. And this is a little different because obviously a 2-year-old is not old enough to be a part of understanding the discipline process in terms of talking. So parents and grandparents wouldn't be talking with a 2-year-old, you'd be observing behavior. So let's talk about a really common one, temper tantrums. 2 years old, most people I know say, my kids didn't go through the terrible twos, it was the terrible threes. That's really what, that was my kids for sure, and my grandkids. And they really weren't terrible. They were just challenging. I would say they were challenging. So if you have a child who is throwing a lot of tantrums, very often it's because the way parents have responded to a child crying is to give them everything they want. So they've learned, if I want something, I need to cry. And if I don't get it quickly enough, I need to throw a tantrum. And so what you need to do in terms of a related, respectful, and reasonable consequence there is, you need to, first of all, affirm the times when they're quiet and be hugging them and stroking them and giving them attention and so forth. And as soon as they start misbehaving and throwing temper tantrums, now, let me be careful to say, I am not talking about every time a child cries. The only way younger kids know to communicate is to cry. But I'm talking about when you know they've been fed, they've been diapered, they've been taken care of, they've been loved, they have everything they need. They're just mad because they're not getting their way. That's what I'm talking about. So what you want to do is you want to take the time to affirm them when they're behaving well. And when they start throwing temper tantrums, put them in a safe place, a crib, a playpen, pack and play, what have you, and stay away from them as long as they're having that temper tantrum. And the moment that they're quiet, go back and start reinforcing the positive. Hi, honey, pick them up, whatever. If they cry and start shaking and throwing a temper tantrum again, put them down. I will tell you, I did this when I was in my 20s working for a babysitting service, and I was helping a family that was having trouble. I was babysitting a child that was often throwing temper tantrums. They were just saying, we're at our wits' end, we don't know what to do. And I said, well, I know something I could try. And so I literally did that for a night. I'd stand outside this little girl's room, and she would have a temper tantrum, and I'd wait until the moment that she stopped. And then I'd go in and I'd reinforce her and hug her and so forth. And if she started having a tantrum, I'd very calmly put her down and leave the room. This went on for, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes, and she calmed down and we had a very pleasant evening. The parents called me the next day and said, what did you do to our daughter? And the way they said it, I was really worried that something had happened. And they said, she had the best night's sleep she's had. She's had the most pleasant day. Teach us, please tell us, what did you do? And this was it. And I've used this over and over and over. I actually learned that from a pediatrician who had 5 children before she went to work as a pediatrician. And so she would always talk from the standpoint of her medical expertise, but also the experience of raising 5 children. Another one would be a wonderful one that a dad actually came up with that I was talking with recently about this issue of related, respectful, and reasonable logical consequences. So basically what was happening was kids were coming home from school. They were in the back seat. The older brother started getting into the younger brother's backpack and tearing things out and getting things out. And of course, the mom and dad were driving and they were trying to pay attention to the road. It was very distracting. So when they were telling me this, he said, I want you to know that I heard what you said about related, respectful, and reasonable. And this is what we came up with. My son, my older son, it's really important to him to be the first one in his class at school every morning. So he gets up and he's very organized and he gets everything ready. We told him that because of that behavior, for 5 days, he is going to have to take his sister's backpack to her room at school before he goes to his room. And so for 5 days, this little boy had to get up early. He was told, and you can't, and the sister was also told, now, sister, you can't make it hard on him. You have to allow him to do what he needs to do. And we're expecting you to be a part of this as well. So she couldn't make it hard or drag her feet going to class so he would be late or anything like that. And so they did it. And I talked to this little boy, well, he's about 12 years old, not little boy, it was his brother. So I talked to this boy and he goes, oh, I'll never do that again. because then he told me the whole story about where he had to go, and he had to go way down to the other end of the hallway. And then he was almost late one day, and he was kind of mortified that he was late. And so he learned, but it was communicated. It was a great, related, respectful, and reasonable way to provide some discipline for that child. Another one would be being very loud and disruptive in a public place. That's more like, the 8 to 10-year-olds. Sometimes the little ones are disruptive without realizing they are being disruptive. So you have to gently help them understand that they have to keep inside voices instead of outside voices and so forth. Sometimes you have to take little ones out to help them understand that it's not okay for them to be behaving that way. But I'm talking about kids that are old enough to know better. And for those kids, really, again, a related consequence would be to say, because you are being disruptive, number one, we are going to leave the store or wherever we are. And also, next time we are going to, let's say it's the mall. Next time we're going to the mall, you will not be allowed to come. And instead, what you're going to do is you're going to write some information down about how you should be behaving when you are in public, because it's not just about the importance of them learning to manage themselves. But one thing that bothers me when I'm in a store and I hear kids misbehaving, not children crying because they're truly hurt or struggling or tired, we all know that, but kids who are being very disruptive, like maybe they want something and mom says, you can't have it. And then they scream and they yell. And kids need to learn that their behavior is affecting other people around them. They need to learn over time to be respectful to the fact that other people are in the same space, and they didn't come to the store to have to listen to you throw a fit. Now, again, I'm talking about kids who are old enough to know better. So for those, you take them out. You do not allow them to go back with you, maybe the next time you go to the store. And then maybe the third time you say, I would like to take you to the store with me or to the mall with me, but remember, this is the behavior that I'm expecting. Can you agree to behave that way? And usually after a few times, they will be able to do that. And then the last example I'm going to use here is maybe when kids are a little bit older and you've got maybe, let's say a 14, 15-year-old girl who sees something in her grandmother's closet that she really likes. Maybe she sees a leather coat that she wants, or maybe she sees some boots. Or I'm thinking of Barb Lorenz because she's a fashionista, isn't she? Every time you come to Grand Monday night, she's dressed so nicely. So maybe she has a nice hat or something. And a few days later, maybe Barb notices that there's a coat missing from her closet, or something that a granddaughter had an eye on. And she knows what happened. She knows that her granddaughter stole it. She didn't just happen to misplace it. It's gone. And this is the age when kids will kind of try to test the waters that way. And especially they might try to test them with grandparents thinking, oh, my grandmother's so nice, she's not going to mind. If kids do that, the obvious consequence is not only do they have to give it back, they have to give it back in the same condition. If it's damaged, they may need to have it repaired. If it's damaged, they may need to purchase something new. They may need to work it off. They may need to do some chores to get that return. And so basically, we're talking about those related, respectful, and reasonable consequences that you can impose. And I think if you are able to work with your children, or if you are a grandparent who is raising children because your children are no longer able to raise their children for whatever reason, if you're raising your grandchildren in that situation, as you start either talking with your children or yourself using these ideas, I think they will work really well for you. And so I encourage you to be creative. I encourage you to have fun with this. A lot of it is the way we communicate to our grandchildren. Sometimes when I'm disciplining my grandchildren, we're laughing together. I'm saying, did you really do that? I can't believe you did that. Okay, let's think about what we're going to do. And so if you present it as this is a learning experience, not as, you're a bad child, but this is a learning experience. We all make mistakes. Let's figure out how you can do better. I encourage you to be creative. I encourage you to have fun with it. And I encourage you especially to collaborate with your children so that you guys can all be on the same page. So I hope that was really helpful. If you have follow-up questions, you can send questions to Ask Dr. Joannie. And I think there are probably some questions that you have now. I'm going to turn it back to Barb, and then Barb will mention the questions that have come in, and I'll try to answer them for you in the next few minutes. And thank you for listening. All righty. I'm here.
Here she is. All right. So question number 1. What was the TBRA again? A couple people asked about that.
TBRI stands for
TBRI.
Trust-Based Relational Intervention. And that was developed by Karen Purvis. And specifically, it was developed, I believe, for children coming out of foster care, but it's widely used now for any child who has trauma in his or her history. And it sometimes is applied for other children who have other kinds of issues going on as well.
And they can find that by just going to the website and taking a look
Mm-hmm.
and learn more.
Right. If you look up Trust-Based Relational Intervention or Dr. Karen Purvis, I believe you should be able to find that information.
Okay. So TBRI. All right. I'm sure we'll have
Correct.
interested in that.
Correct.
All right. So yeah, there's another question about that. And so thank you for filling us in for that. What 2 book authors did you mention?
Oh, I mentioned the book that you're giving away by Josh.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Wasn't it Discipling Your Grandchildren?
Discipling Grandkids.
And it's a great book. That's a great one.
Okay.
And even though you said disciplining, it was discipling, but at the same time, the discipling part includes discipline. So that's why I mentioned it. And the other one is Positive Discipline by Jane Nelson. Positive Discipline by Jane Nelson.
Okay, great. Dwight will probably put that in our chat. How do you handle when an older brother hits a younger brother?
That's a really great one. That's a common one. And I do have that in my notes that I'll, send tomorrow. But the first thing is that you have to respond by making sure both children are safe. The other thing is be a keen observer, because almost always there are things going on between the 2 kids. It's usually not just that one child is the innocent one. Now, sometimes it is. But clearly you need to separate the children so that the one who is being hit will not get hit again. And then what I usually will encourage in terms of that related piece is for a child to spend a little bit of time in timeout. And when he or she comes back and you've discussed with the child that hitting is not okay, and that's something that will not be tolerated, that child then needs to do 3 things that are positive and affirming to the child. So you're kind of saying that you're hitting and you're hurting your brother or sister. And so now I want you to show how you can not hurt, and it not only not hurt, but be kind to your brother or sister. Now, here's another thing for us to remember. Be very observant of yourselves and your children, and recognize when maybe you do things that they are modeling. So I'll use myself as a great example. My grandchildren were in my presence one time when my husband said something, and I slapped him on the shoulder, not in anger at all. It was kind of like, haha, kind of like when you do that, when you say, oh, come on, you don't mean that. Okay. But what they saw was they saw their grandmother hit their grandfather. And so later on, I saw them doing the same thing to one another. And they also weren't doing it in anger. But very unintentionally, I had taught them that. And then a little bit later, when they did get into it and they were kind of angry with each other, then it was like this. And I had to say, I just taught them this. So we had to go backwards and say, okay, let's talk about this. It's okay to touch one another and so forth, but we don't hit in anger and those kinds of things. And so it was a teachable moment.
Yeah, that's good. The 2.5-year-old, when refuses to come in or stay or stop, just continues in defiance. 2.5 years.
Yeah. And that's that temper tantrum stuff. 2.5-year-olds, they only know how to express their frustrations via temper. So you have to separate them from whatever it is that they, 2.5, they're young enough that you can pick them up and bring them in and separate them, put them in a crib, a playpen, what have you. It's okay for them to behave that way for a while. But again, as I said, what you want to do is reinforce the times when they're quiet. And what's great about a 2.5-year-old is you actually can pick them up and you can remove them and put them in safe places and help them understand that they cannot behave that way. And especially if it's outside or what have you, some of them are old enough to begin to understand, 3-word sentence, here is safe, or here you need to be, or something like that. Some of them are old enough. Some of them don't understand that yet at that age. And so you have to separate them from where they are. And then little by little by little, a lot of these things take time. They don't happen in one event, but it takes time. Little by little, you teach them that if they are going to have the privilege of doing things like going outside, there are certain behaviors that are required. So as soon as they're misbehaving, that's when you need to take them in and give them time out, what have you. What happens for a lot of people is they say, I'll give you 3 chances. Not a good idea, because then kids learn I can misbehave 3 times before there's any consequence. And so you've just extended the amount of time that you're going to be miserable. And so they're young and they need that direction. And they will respond well to that if you do that consistently, and your children do as well.
Here's a couple questions here related to parents. So I'll just ask you both of them. One is, how do you react if her daughter often stops her mid-sentence or right after I point out something sort of misbehavior to my grandkids? And the other one just seems to want to know too, what about when parents are there and you don't want to disrespect those? Kind of related.
When parents are there, it's probably best for the parents to impose the consequences, for them to do the discipline and for you to step back. Even if they've done something to you. Now, if they've done something to you and the parents don't respond, it's important to take them aside and say, that didn't feel good to me, or that felt really disrespectful, or, I think something needs to be done. But parents should be the first to do that. Now, when you get stopped mid-sentence, that's an indication that your child is feeling maybe judged. And so it might be better to wait until later and say, hey, I'd like to talk with you about what happened earlier today with whomever, and chat about it outside of the situation later on. And it's always best to start with how it impacted you. So using those I messages instead of you shouldn't have done this, or you shouldn't have done that, or we should have done something better. You say something like, I felt really disrespected when this happened earlier. So your child, the parent, understands how the misbehavior affected you and is more likely to then be able to empathize and realize that something needs to be done. But I would say if they're stopping you mid-sentence, it's probably because whether you're intending to judge them or not, they're feeling judged. And so step aside, talk about it a little bit later on.
What do you do if the grandchild says, my mom doesn't do that? She doesn't ask me to do that.
That's exactly why grandparents and parents need to be talking together. I would probably let that go at the moment and then talk with mom and say, help me understand what it is you do when that happens. And if it's no discipline and you feel like there needs to be discipline, then you can have a discussion. But do talk with the parents. And that's why that collaboration is so important, because not only do you want to be on the same page with your children as their parents, but you want kids to not be confused. And it is confusing for kids if parents do one thing and grandparents do something else. Sometimes it's the opposite. Parents have a lot of rules and grandparents are like, oh, when you come to my house, it's grandma's house. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do this. I can feed you as much candy as I want. I'm grandma. That's really disrespectful to parents, and it's very confusing for children. And it also sets kids up now. Where do you think those kids are going to want to be? They're going to want to be at grandma's house or grandpa's house, not with mom and dad if they get to do whatever they want to at grandma's house.
Yeah. Well, we have time for one more. This is an interesting question. She said, we spanked our kids, not out of anger, but it seemed fitting.
Mm-hmm.
And our son does not believe in that with his children. He doesn't believe it's appropriate. So we feel burdened about this. I wonder if I need to ask forgiveness, or we all love the Lord. We're in his word. We prayed about our parenting, but now I'm wondering, I have some doubts and maybe regrets.
You know, that's a very, very common question, Barb. You know, parenting techniques change over generations. I will tell you that at Focus on the Family, where I do a lot of work, we have a number of resources that talk about spanking, when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. We do take the idea that spanking can be appropriate in certain and very limited conditions, and also that there are many other ways of disciplining that are better than spanking in the vast majority of cases. So in most cases, we want to go toward things like rewards and consequences and so forth. The two times when it does seem to be really appropriate is, number one, if a child is ready to be hurt. I mean, clearly, if a child is ready to run out in front of a car, grabbing that child and spanking him on the bottom is a much better thing to do than allow that child to get hurt, obviously. And sometimes you have to spank to get their attention in those situations. And you can talk to them later and say, I'm sorry to have to do that, but I didn't want you to be hurt, and help them understand. The other one is when they're being willfully disobedient. That's the case where you have done all of the other things that we typically do to get kids to respond well, and they're not working. And it's just that I dug in and I'm going to get my way and I'm going to be defiant and so forth. And in those cases, sometimes spanking can be appropriate. But again, we always want to try other things first. And yet I will say, I'm not ashamed at all to say here that when my children were little, there were some times I spanked them. I can count on one hand the number of times I spanked both of them. So it wasn't a regular thing I did all of the time. I don't think that this grandmother necessarily needs to seek forgiveness, but it might be great to have a conversation and say, this is something that was done more at that time. Now we know that there are other ways that are probably more effective, and maybe have a conversation with her son and say, you know, are you concerned about the fact that I spanked you, et cetera? And it would be just a great opportunity to open up that door and the communication between the grandparent and the parent.